In December 1989, a woman stayed up all night waiting for news about her son who had disappeared in a shopping mall. The next day, the police knocked on her door to say that the boy had been found, but dead in the desert. 3 shots to the head. Days later, this woman was arrested. Months later, she was tried, and then she spent more than 2 decades on death row awaiting execution. But there's a part of this story that's unsettling, let's say, because the only thing that put this woman in prison and then on death row was the word of a single man. With no recording, no witness, no signature, nothing but the memory of a detective who locked himself in a room alone with her for 30 minutes and then destroyed his own notes. And this detective, let me tell you, had quite a history, you know? Which the prosecution had supposedly known about for years but hid from the jury, but there's a lot more to it. I'm Marcos Campos, and this story raises a question that the American legal system still hasn't been able to answer properly, okay? How many other Debras are out there? People who spent decades on death row because of a confession that maybe never even happened. But hold on, everything points to that, but like I said, there are some other things involved. The case is complex, and in the end, you'll tell me if she's innocent or not. With that said, let's get to the facts. Well, to understand what happened that December when the case started, you first need to understand who Debra Milka was back in 1989. Well, she was born in West Berlin on March 10th, 1964. Her father was an American who was serving in the United States Air Force. Her mother was German. In 1965, when Debra was less than 8 years old, the family moved back to the United States. She grew up there, finished high school, went to college, and basically was raised there. In 1984, she married a guy named Mark Milka. In 1985, their only son was born, Christopher Conan Milka. In 1988, 3 years later, their marriage ended in divorce. Mark was actually a bit of a complicated guy, a drug addict, and had even been to prison. Debra even had a restraining order against Mark. He couldn't see his son whenever he wanted and all that, so she wanted Christopher to live far from that, right? From his father's unstable life. So, at 25 years old, she was now alone with a 4-year-old child, working at an insurance company with plenty of money coming in. But she was saving money despite that, so she could rent an apartment for herself. Despite this totally useless, unstable start to her life as a mother, right? Debra had plans. While Debra was saving her money to finally rent her own apartment, she and her little son Christopher were living with a guy, actually sharing an apartment with a man named James Stiers. He was a Vietnam War veteran whom she met through her sister. Remember, they came from a military family and all, right? So this was kind of a practical arrangement, nothing romantic or sexual. Debra was just staying at the guy's place because he was helping her out. And according to her, she paid her share of the rent, and in exchange, the friend would take care of Christopher when she was working and so on. Her plan was that after Christmas that year, she would leave the guy's house and move into her own place, finally. In August of 1989, however, the three of them moved in together. They continued living together somewhere else. Don't ask me why, because I couldn't find the reason for that. I don't know. It just happened. I know that in September of 89 weeks after that move, Debra got hired at another job there and she got a life insurance policy. It was a plan, a benefit that the company helped her get. The value of that policy was $5,000. We're talking about almost 40 years ago, right, guys? So the beneficiary of that policy was Christopher's mother herself. It was linked to Christopher. James Stiers, her friend, knew about the existence of that policy. Look, here we have, I would say, the main link that will help unravel this case over the next 20 years of events. Just watch. James Lynn Stiers, I don't know how to pronounce it, was 41 years old back in 1989. As I said, he was a war veteran, a veteran of the Vietnam War, right? And also a troubled guy. Actually, he had serious financial problems and he also had a long-standing friendship with a weird guy, a guy named Roger Scott. A man who, according to the court documents themselves later on, didn't have a steady job and lived off favors. In other words, just saying it like this, it doesn't seem like anything good would come from it, right? And honestly, it didn't. Remember the introduction to the case when I said that a mother was there, distressed, waiting for news about her little boy who had gotten lost in the mall? So, take a look at what, according to the prosecution, is said to have happened that day. And look, the prosecution's theory is built from the interrogations of James Stiers himself, okay? Just to remind you, James is Debra's friend and Roger is James's friend. Got it? And the prosecution's theory is as follows. At some point before December of '89, James and Debra supposedly talked about Christopher's life insurance, which was linked to her little son, Christopher. James would have then proposed a plan, and Debra would have agreed to this plan. James then supposedly arranged with Roger, his friend, that the two of them would take the boy out to the desert, and James would shoot him. In exchange, Roger would receive a sum of money there, and James would keep part of the $5,000 life insurance payout. Guys, according to some sources, Roger would get $250 for what the two of them did together, right? Taking the life of a 4-year-old child. This is the prosecution's version, okay? What the trial was never able to independently prove is the link between this version and Debra Milk. Why? Let me explain. Because neither James nor Roger ever, in their own trials later, pointed to Debra as the one who ordered it in court. And the only person who said she was involved in this whole story, and even claimed she confessed, was a detective named Armando Saldete. But hold on, I'll talk about this guy in a minute. There's a lot to say about him, okay? Hold on. First, let's go back to that Saturday in December 1989 when the innocent little child was about to go out. It was December 2nd, 1989, just weeks before Christmas, right? Christopher was 4 years old. On the day before that, he had visited Santa Claus at the Metro Center Mall in Phoenix, Arizona. He liked it so much that he asked to go back. James Stiers offered to take the boy. Back then, everyone lived together there. Everything was fine. He took Debra's car that morning and told Christopher, the little boy, that they were going to the mall again to see Santa Claus, and they left. So Debra would have stayed at home doing laundry, going about her routine, and what happened next, which I'm going to tell you about, comes from the statements of those involved, okay? James Stiers stopped by Roger Scott's apartment, his friend, and picked the guy up. And the three of them, James, Roger, and little Christopher, went out around town, had lunch together, made a few stops. Everything was normal, but only for a short time. Then James drove the car to a ravine in the desert north of Phoenix, a completely isolated place with no witnesses. And it was there that those two treacherous cowards murdered Christopher with 3 shots to the head. In the afternoon then, on that same day, as if nothing had happened, or suddenly I was thinking, maybe it happened as planned, right? I don't know. You tell me later what you think. Well, James called Debra's house, where they all lived together, and said that Christopher had disappeared at the mall. He lost the boy at the mall. Debra then, terrified, called the police immediately, and soon the Phoenix police started a missing child investigation. James went to the mall, helped with the search anyway. He was being helpful. That night, Debra stayed up the whole time waiting for any news. The next day, December 3rd, the police arrested Roger Scott. After more than 14 hours of interrogation, he ended up confessing. He said he knew where Christopher was, that the boy was dead. Roger Scott then took the police to the ravine out in the desert, which deserves a side note, right guys? At that point in the investigation, the two of them, who were the last ones to be with Christopher, of course they were the first to be questioned by the police, right? It seems that Roger, already on the first night of questioning, confessed. Christopher's body was found that same day. 4 years old, guys, 3 shots to the head in a dry dirt ditch in the Arizona desert. That's really evil, isn't it? James Stiers, the friend, was prosecuted next, okay? The two were tried separately later as the investigation progressed. They had confessed, right? For first-degree murder and sentenced to death, and as far as we know, they remain on death row to this day, okay? After all this time. With both men under arrest at the time, the police turned their attention to Debra. There was something that bothered the investigators, the life insurance policy. A mother takes out a $5,000 policy there, maybe in partnership with the company she worked for. I don't really know how that worked. For her little son, weeks before he was killed by the roommate. Strange, right? Coincidence? It could be. But that's the kind of detail that can't go unnoticed. And it didn't, and it needed an explanation. So, Detective Armando Saldete Jr. came into the picture. Remember I mentioned that name a little while ago, right? So, Saldete had a 20-year career with the Phoenix police. He was known as a skilled, methodical, and persistent interrogator. Colleagues said he had a gift for making people talk. He himself said in an interview given to the Phoenix News-Times years later, "Look, my belief is that everyone, no matter the crime, will tell the truth. You just need to give them the opportunity. Hold on, soon you'll tell me something about this." When Debra showed up to give her statement, Detective Saldate was off duty that day, but he made a point of going there. He wanted to interrogate her. So, he put Debra in a closed room and stayed there with her for 30 minutes. No camera, no recorder, no lawyer, nothing. No witnesses, just the two of them. Saldate's superior, according to reports from the case, even asked if he was going to record the interrogation. Saldate said that Debra had refused. Debra confirmed that she really did refuse the recording. It's actually one of the few things that both of them agree on, okay? She claims that she refused because Saldate said that the recording was optional, and she didn't really understand the implication of that at the time. Maybe she was anxious, afraid, frustrated, in shock, you know, the loss of her son and all that. Saldate claims, however, that the refusal was deliberate, and that she did in fact fully understand what was happening. 3 days after that, Saldate presented a 7-page written report, describing what had happened during those 30 minutes of interrogation. In it, he stated that Debra Milk had spontaneously confessed that she planned her own son's murder with James Stanley, that she wanted the insurance money, and that she thought Christopher would grow up to be like his father, an addict, a criminal, that the boy was an inconvenience to her. Saldate wrote that she said the following: "I just decided it would be better for Christopher to die." He also wrote that she had voluntarily given up the right to have a lawyer present during the interrogation there. After writing the report, Saldate destroyed the original notes she took during the interrogation. All very strange and unusual, don't you think? Debra denied all of that completely. She says she never confessed to anything, that Saldate took phrases said in a context of mourning and despair and twisted their meaning, and made up the rest, that she never gave up her right to a lawyer, that Saldate simply acted as if that right didn't exist, that he was a huge and intimidating guy with a piercing look, and that she was very scared. Well, it's complicated, isn't it? Literally, it's one person's word against the others. I would say that actually that's the core of this case here, which is one of the most controversial in history. But up to this point, go ahead and leave your comment and tell me what you think. Well, sometime after that, the prosecution offered a deal to Roger Scott, the friend of Debra's friend. You remember, right? So the deal would be 21 years in prison instead of the death penalty in exchange for testimony against Debra Milk. Scott accepted the deal, but when it was time for Debra's trial, he didn't say anything directly in court. Neither did James.
Os dois ficaram calados.
Neither of the two men. It was actually proven that they took Christopher to the desert and killed the boy. They accused Debra of nothing in front of the jury. The only direct evidence against her was Detective Saldate's word, and that's another huge link in this case. Why didn't they use it, right? Later we'll have more things, more details, then you'll connect everything and you'll say, wow, but that was the only way to have a path to follow, and they didn't. But I held on. Debra Milk's trial, guys, happened in 1990, okay? The prosecutor built the case on 2 pillars, the $5,000 life insurance policy and the supposed confession to the detective. The prosecutor portrayed Debra as a mother who saw her son as an obstacle, a hindrance to a better life. A young woman who wanted to get rid of the child who suddenly tied her to her ex-husband. The defense tried to discredit the confession. Debra took the witness stand and denied every word that Detective Saldate had attributed to her. She said she had never harmed her son and that Christopher meant everything to her. But Debra had a serious problem even before the trial began. She didn't have any money. The legal representation she received in the first years was inadequate. These are important details about Saldate that could have changed the course of the trial. All these details were never discovered or presented by her defense. Not because they didn't exist, okay guys? But since the defense lacked resources to investigate fully. Stirring up a hornet's nest, right? Look, let's say a fierce defense attorney would have had a field day with this case, right? Well, given all that, the jury had to make a choice at that moment. To believe the detective with 20 years of experience, a skilled interrogator, or to believe a mother who was being accused of ordering her own son's murder to get the life insurance. The jury chose the detective. On January 18, 1991, Debra Milk was sentenced to death. At 26 years old, she entered Arizona's women's death row. One of only 4 women who occupied that space in the state at that time. But as sometimes happens, right? There's something fishy going on here, and I don't even need to say it. What the jury didn't know, and what the prosecution never told them, is the twist. Check this out. Armando Saldete, the skilled detective, had a history. Look, it has to do with skill. It's not a rumor, guys. It's not a baseless accusation, okay? It's a documented history with dates, case numbers, and detailed descriptions that the prosecutor's office itself knew about and kept secret throughout the entire trial. Saldate had been suspended for a while, just so you have an idea of his duties. After he stopped a female driver at a checkpoint, he said to her right there, "You've got a few violations here. I can look the other way, but only in exchange for something, you know?" You know, right? So, after systematically lying to his superiors about what had happened, he only stopped denying it when he was subjected to a polygraph, and the result was unfavorable. It was just a 5-day suspension, and he returned to work. And it doesn't end there, of course. In 4 different cases, judges had annulled confessions or indictments because they concluded that Saldate had lied under oath. In another 4 cases, confessions were suppressed because he had violated the suspect's constitutional rights during interrogation. In one of those cases, he interrogated a person who was suffering from a skull fracture. The man was so disoriented he didn't know his name, the year, or who the president was. These are basic questions used to check if someone is oriented. Saldate interrogated him anyway and produced a confession. In another case, he interrogated a suspect in a hospital room while the man was hooked up to an IV on medication, drifting in and out of consciousness. Saldate told the nurse that she couldn't administer painkillers to that patient specifically until he had finished talking to him. And this, guys, was the man whose word had put Debra Milk on death row. The Court of Appeals years later discovered all this after defense researchers spent more than 7,000 hours combing through court records looking for Saldate's name. 7,000 hours to find what the prosecution already had and didn't hand over. Here I'd say there's another link, right? Because like if she really did confess, when you look at the guy's rotten history, then you side with her and say, I'll believe her since she says she didn't confess. If that's true and you consider the guy's history, it's clear she didn't confess. But then there's the question, why would the guys do that, right? Well, the defense even subpoenaed Saldate's records, still talking about him during the original trial, okay? The state asked the court to block this subpoena. The court partially accepted it, but the most compromising records never made it to the jury. For more than 22 years, Debra Milk woke up every morning on death row in Arizona, accused of killing or ordering the killing of her own son. She, of course, filed appeals, lost, filed more appeals. The state courts repeatedly upheld the conviction. Without money and with poor legal representation in her early years there, the case moved slowly through the federal courts. Debra became a relatively well-known case among activists against wrongful convictions. She was one of the women most often mentioned when talking about mistakes in the American death penalty system. But wrongful convictions are hard to overturn, you know? Very hard, I would say. The system doesn't really like to admit it made a mistake, you know? Especially in homicide cases, but there's always a catch, isn't there? In March 2013, more than 22 years after the conviction, a panel of 3 judges from the United States Court of Appeals unanimously overturned Debra Milk's conviction. The decision ran for pages. It was devastating. That group of judges concluded that the prosecution had unconstitutionally remained silent about a treasure trove of impeachment evidence against the main and practically only witness in the case. The court stated that Saldate had a documented history of lying in the course of his duties and that the jurors never knew about it. And they would have known if the prosecution had fulfilled its constitutional obligation to turn over that material to the defense. The chief judge of that panel, Alex Kuczynski, in a concurring opinion, was even more direct. He wrote that Saldate turned the interrogation room into a black box, leaving no objectively verifiable evidence of what happened inside. And he said that the supposed confession, if it was obtained at all, was extracted illegally. The court referred the case to the Department of Justice for investigation of civil rights violations by Saldate and the Maricopa County Prosecutor's Office. In September 2013, Debra Milk was released on bail of $250,000 after more than 22 years in prison. An electronic ankle monitor was placed on her there because technically she was still a defendant, awaiting the court's decision on a possible new trial. Prosecutor Bill Montgomery called the decision by this group of judges excessive and said that an irritated legal advisor had written the opinion without reading the entire case file. He said he'd seek a new trial for Debra, but I wonder, what's the point of reading the case file if it's all tainted? In March 2015, the Arizona Supreme Court blocked the new trial, ruling that there had been blatant prosecutorial misconduct in the original case, which, combined with the state's stronger double jeopardy protections, made any new proceedings unfeasible. On March 23, 2015, Judge Rosa Moss of the Maricopa County Superior Court dismissed all charges against Debra Milk permanently, with no possibility of reopening the case. And at that moment, Debra left the courtroom without showing joy. She said, "I don't feel happiness. What I feel is relief." Saldate was never criminally prosecuted. Incredibly enough, the federal statute of limitations for prosecuting his offenses had already expired. In 2015, Debra filed a civil lawsuit against the city of Phoenix and Maricopa County, seeking compensation for the 23 years she spent in prison. The lawsuit claimed that the authorities had hidden evidence that would have proven her innocence, and that the police themselves may have destroyed Saldate's personal file. The case went on for years. In 2017, during the civil lawsuit proceedings, there was a very strange and unusual point in this story. Debra went back to her homeland, Germany, and she destroyed those documents. There were entire boxes of material related to the case, including her personal diary, where she wrote right after the conviction, records she had accumulated during the years in prison, material that her mother had gathered over decades of appeals. In addition, she and her lawyers took down a website and social media pages that had been created to raise public awareness about her case. Why did she do that? You must be wondering, right? I don't know either. That question has never had a public answer. She never gave an explanation about that. What the federal judge concluded in the civil case records is that these documents, especially the diary written right after the conviction, were exactly the ones that would have addressed the central issue of the case, what really happened in that interrogation with Saldate. By destroying them, she removed from the case the only source of personal and contemporary record, her own version. Debra Milk never received a single cent for the 2 decades she spent in prison. On death row, to be more precise, right? The court decision pointed out that by destroying them, she kind of actively undermined her own case. For someone who spent more than 2 decades possibly being a victim of a system that hid evidence, destroying evidence in her own compensation case is a pretty strange choice, and it cost her everything, right? Let's be honest, it doesn't make sense, does it? James Steers and Roger Scott are still on death row over in Arizona. No one disputes that they were the ones who took little Christopher for a ride in that car, but they took him to the desert and shot the child 3 times in the head that December Saturday when the little boy thought he was going to see Santa Claus. What remains without a definitive answer is simpler and perhaps more disturbing than any theory, okay? What really happened in those 30 minutes in a closed room with no cameras, no recording, no witnesses, with the notes destroyed right after? A woman says she never confessed to anything. A detective with a documented history of lying under oath says that she did confess, yes. The only 2 men who could corroborate anything, the ones who actually killed the child, do not identify her as the one who ordered it in court. I think that's the part that confuses us the most, isn't it? If the 2 men would benefit from the child's death, they'd need some connection to the child's mother, don't you think? There was no other link. If that's not it, what would be the other reason? Malice? And look, it was exactly this big question mark that formed the basis of the entire accusation in the case, okay? They said that, she would have to have a connection with them. Despite all that, she actually ended up in jail, right? The system believed the detective. And later, when she tried to prove that she had been a victim of this system, she destroyed the evidence she herself had kept. If this case isn't unusual, I don't know what is. Little Christopher Milk would be 40 years old today. My lovely friends, leave your comments here for me. I'm curious to know what you think about all this. Definitely one of the most unusual and controversial cases I've ever told here. Thanks for being here. A kiss from the redhead. See you next episode.